look closely at this image. What do you see? A tropical paradise? Or a mafia casino? No. What you are seeing is a subsidiary of the United States. In 1958, America didn't just influence Cuba. America owned Cuba. 90% of the mines, 80% of the utilities, 50% of the railways, and 40% of the sugar production. Havana wasn't a capital city. It was the accounting department of a Caribbean empire. But on January 1st, 1959, the money printer was unplugged. It wasn't just a revolution. It was the largest default in Western history. America didn't lose an island because of ideology. They lost it because they turned a nation into a luxury hotel and forgot to pay the staff. And the cost of that bankruptcy is still haunting Washington today. As the Cadillacs rust, the nuclear submarines have begun to dock. Welcome to Empire Econ. Today, we open the file on the Havana Liability. Most historians look at Cuba and see a political struggle. They see Che Guevara in the jungle. They see Fidel Castro giving speeches. But that is the romantic version of history. If you want to understand why America really lost its mind over this island, you shouldn't look at the politicians. You should look at the accountants. To understand the crash, we have to go back to the construction. In the late 1940s, the American underworld had a crisis of success. Post-war America was booming. The Mafia families in New York and Chicago were generating tens of millions of dollars in cash from gambling, narcotics, and unions. But cash is heavy. Cash smells. And most importantly, cash leaves a trail. The FBI was getting smarter. The IRS was closing the loopholes. The mob needed a place to wash the money. A place where the US Constitution didn't apply. Enter Meyer Lansky. Lansky was different. He didn't have the muscles of a thug. He had the mind of a hedge fund manager. The press called him the mob's accountant, but he was really the visionary of the syndicate. In December 1946, Lansky organized the most important meeting in criminal history, the Havana Conference. Imagine this scene: the Hotel Nacional, the entire board of directors of the American Mafia, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, sitting around a table, overlooking the ocean. They weren't there for the sun. They were there to carve up a country. Lansky's pitch was simple. Las Vegas was good, but it was still in America. It was still subject to federal law. Cuba could be different. Cuba could be a sovereign sanctuary. But to build a state within a state, they needed a gatekeeper. They found him in Fulgencio Batista. Batista was a man who understood the language of leverage. In 1952, when Batista seized power in a military coup, the deal was finalized. It was the ultimate public-private partnership. Batista provided the army, the police, and the sovereignty. Lansky provided the capital and the expertise. The construction boom that followed was unprecedented. The Riviera, the Capri, the Nacional. These weren't just hotels. They were industrial-scale financial pumps. Here is how the mechanism worked: the Skim. Every night, in the counting rooms of Havana, millions of dollars poured in from tourists. Before the books were audited for taxes, the Skim was taken off the top. Suitcases full of tax-free cash were flown from Havana to Miami, then wired to numbered accounts in Switzerland. It was elegant, it was efficient, and it was perfectly legal, because the man who wrote the gambling laws for the Cuban government was Meyer Lansky himself. By 1958, Havana generated more revenue for the Mafia than Las Vegas. They had bought a government for pennies on the dollar, and the returns were infinite. Or so they thought. But the Mafia were just the flashy tenants in the penthouse. If you looked at the foundation of the building, you saw the logos of Wall Street. We often forget the sheer scale of American dominance in the 1950s. This wasn't trade. This was ownership. By the late 50s, the economic sovereignty of Cuba was a myth. Let's look at the big three. First, the land. The United Fruit Company and other American syndicates owned nearly 75% of the arable land in Cuba. Think about that. 3/4 of the soil belonged to foreign entities. Cuban farmers didn't farm their own land. They worked as seasonal laborers on American plantations. Second, the utilities. If you turned on a light bulb in Havana, you paid the Cuban Electric Company, owned by a firm in Florida. If you picked up a telephone, you paid ITT, an American corporation. The infrastructure of the nation was a subscription service, and the payments were sent abroad. Third, and most critical, the sugar quota. This was the leash around Cuba's neck. Cuba's entire economy relied on exporting sugar to the U.S. Washington controlled the quota, the amount of sugar the U.S. would buy at a subsidized price. This meant that at any moment, if the Cuban government stepped out of line, Washington could simply cut the quota and bankrupt the island overnight. It was a system of total control. Cuba was not a country. It was a subsidiary. The contrast on the ground was dystopian. In Havana, you had the Paris of the Caribbean, Cadillacs, Dior dresses, and air-conditioned casinos. The highest number of TVs per capita in Latin America. But drive 30 minutes outside the city, and you entered the Middle Ages. No electricity, no running water, illiteracy rates over 40%, children dying of parasites. The American business elite and the Cuban upper class lived in a bubble of golden prosperity. They believed the party would last forever because they believed they were untouchable. They looked at the peasants in the countryside and saw cheap labor. They didn't realize they were looking at an army in waiting. And the man keeping this volatile machine together was Batista. He wasn't governing, he was looting. His regime demanded a cut of everything, a percentage of the slot machines, a bribe for every construction permit, a kickback on the sugar exports. It was a kleptocracy so brazen that even the U.S. State Department started to get uncomfortable. President Eisenhower famously stopped sending him weapons in 1958, sensing the end was near. But the corporations didn't stop. The Mafia didn't stop. The dividends were too good to leave. They kept the music playing, ignoring the sound of gunfire coming from the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Empires usually die slowly, fading away over decades. The American Empire in Cuba died in violent spasms. New Year's Eve, 1958. While the Americans were popping champagne in the ballroom of the Hotel Nacional, Fulgencio Batista was at a military airfield. He boarded a plane at 3 a.m., stuffing his luggage with a reported $300 million from the National Treasury. The CEO had fled with the payroll. When Fidel Castro's rebels rolled into Havana on January 8th, the mood wasn't anti-American yet. It was anti-Batista. At first, Washington thought they could manage Castro. They thought he was just another nationalist who could be bought or bullied like the ones before him. They were wrong. The conflict didn't start with guns. It started with oil. In 1960, the Soviet Union sent crude oil to Cuba. Castro asked the American-owned refineries on the island Texaco, Esso, Shell, to refine it. Under orders from Washington, the corporations refused. They wanted to squeeze the new government. Castro's response was the turning point of the Cold War. He didn't negotiate. He didn't back down. He nationalized the refineries. President Eisenhower retaliated by canceling the sugar quota, the economic lifeline of the island. Washington thought this would cause the Cuban economy to collapse and force Castro out. Instead, it pushed him all in. On the 6th of August 1960, Castro went to a stadium in Havana and read from a list. It was the expropriation law. One by one, he seized the assets of American capitalism. The telephone company? Seized. The electric company? seized. The 36 sugar mills owned by United Fruit, seized. Then came the Mafia's turn. The rebels stormed the casinos. They smashed the slot machines in the streets as symbols of corruption. They burned the debt ledgers. They turned the posh hotels into housing for the poor or headquarters for the revolution. In the blink of an eye, assets worth $1.8 billion in 1960 currency, that's nearly $20 billion today, evaporated. It was the largest uncompensated seizure of American property in history. Meyer Lansky, the genius who never lost everything. He died years later in Miami, with little money left, still trying to figure out how his perfect equation failed. He had factored in the police. He had factored in the bribes. He forgot to factor in the rage of a bankrupt nation. This brings us to the present day. The United States has spent the last 60 years trying to punish Cuba for that theft. The embargo, the Bay of Pigs, the exclusion from the global banking system. We are told this is about human rights. But let's be cynical for a moment. The embargo is a foreclosure attempt that never ended. It is a warning to any other nation in the hemisphere. Do not touch the assets. But in geopolitics, nature abhors a vacuum, and prime real estate never stays empty for long. When America walked away from the property, other tenants moved in. First, it was the Soviets. For 30 years, Moscow subsidized the Cuban economy. They bought the sugar at 5 times the market price and sold oil at a discount. Why? Not for charity. They were paying rent for the Lord Sigint Station, a massive spy base just south of Havana that could intercept every phone call in the eastern United States. They were paying for a parking spot for their nuclear missiles. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Cuba was left alone. The economy imploded. But today, a new player has entered the game. A player with deeper pockets than the Soviets ever had. China. China doesn't need to put nuclear missiles in Cuba. Their strategy is subtler. They are buying the debt. They are upgrading the ports. They are installing the telecommunications infrastructure. Recent intelligence reports suggest China is operating electronic eavesdropping facilities on the island. Just last week, Russian warships, including a nuclear-powered submarine, docked in Havana Harbor. Why does this matter? Because location is the one asset you cannot replicate. Cuba sits at the gateway to the Gulf of Mexico. It commands the shipping lanes of the Caribbean. It is 90 miles from Key West. In modern warfare, where reaction time is measured in seconds, that proximity is priceless. While Washington debates whether to let American tourists visit Havana, Beijing, and Moscow are fortifying. They are treating Cuba as a strategic asset. America is treating it as a grudge. The business empire that Lansky and United Fruit built didn't disappear. It just changed management. So, what is the sobering lesson of the Havana Liability? It is a lesson about the cost of extraction. You cannot run a foreign nation like a private equity firm forever. America treated Cuba as a balance sheet item, an asset to be squeezed for maximum yield. The corporations extracted the sugar. The Mafia extracted the cash. And they reinvested nothing but corruption. When you treat a neighbor like a servant, don't be surprised when they open the back door to your enemies. We are now entering a new era of great power competition. The Caribbean is no longer an American lake. It is a contested frontier. The embargo has kept the Castros poor, but it hasn't made America safer. In fact, by isolating Cuba, we have pushed it into the arms of the only powers willing to pay its bills. The question I leave you with is this. Looking at the Russian flags in Havana Harbor today, was the price of vengeance too high? Is it time for America to try to buy the property back? Or has the lease expired for good? I read every comment. Tell me your verdict below. And if you want to know the truth about the rest of the global economy, subscribe.